A few of our education staff members have been thinking a little bit more deeply about this theme and how we can make connections between what we're experiencing today and what's still experienced during his lifetime. We're excited to be in conversation with you today and learn more about your perspectives on this subject.
Welcome to the tour, Art in Times of Crisis. I'm an educator at the museum, and I'm excited to co-facilitate with my colleagues Corey and Kenda today. Before we get started, we would also love to know if you've been to the Clyfford Still Museum or if you're familiar with Clyfford Still. And if you'd like to say that in the chat, that would be wonderful. So we currently are finding ourselves in a time of crisis, ongoing. And this is something that will forever change the way that we live. The start of the year was marked by the outbreak of COVID-19 around the world. And while the pandemic is ongoing, the United States is beginning to reckon with the systemic racism that has plagued the nation since its founding. Clyfford Still also lived through multiple times of crisis in his lifetime, and he continued to create during these periods. He lived through the 1918 flu pandemic, the Great Depression, World War II, and his own personal battle with cancer, among others. Today we'll place Clyfford Still's work in the historical context and consider some possible artistic responses to crises. And like Nicole mentioned, this is meant to be a discussion, so we would love to hear from you in the chat. And we hope to have time to answer some questions as we transition from gallery to gallery. Times of crisis put humanity to the test like nothing else. Crises challenge who we are, how we live. They affect the personal, professional, and social ways of life. And many suffer from trauma during and after crises. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, some of us have had more time, some of us have had less time to think about these things and for ourselves. People all over the world have been experiencing unimaginable uncertainty and grief. In the modern era, white supremacy has also been one of the greatest forms of social trauma across the globe. For many, a lot of questions have surfaced, and thanks to the Black Lives Matter movement and calls for the end of systems of oppression, as well as calls for justice, inclusion, and equity. How we manage and work with crises is very individual. Art making, as we know, is a form of creative expression, which has been around since the time of cave dwellers. And expressing our emotions and experiences through creative outlets can help us heal and move through life with coping mechanisms and compassion. I would like to know from you all what kinds of feelings that you have been experiencing over the past few months, and how are you coping? Please share with us in the chat. For me, I am a slow processor, and I need to spend time with my feelings and really kind of work through how I'm feeling, where I am in the situation that I'm in. Personally, it's been very overwhelming, and I feel like my emotions have been very heightened through all of this. My previous experience with trauma was last summer when I suffered from a traumatic brain injury due to a car accident. And thankfully, after a few difficult months, I got my bearings back. And for me personally, meditation has really helped kind of calm the nerves, give me more of a sense of grounding, and lots of patience as well. So if you haven't already, we'd love to hear from you in the chat. And I'm just going to take a quick peek. Thanks for sharing with us. I'm excited to start looking at some artwork with you all, and I'm going to hand this over to my colleague, Corey. Oh, and one thing too, we're using virtual gallery. Our curator, Bailey Platchek, will be steering, so please let us know if we are going too fast or too slow. Thank you.
Allison, we have a couple of things in the chat for you.
Great.
So we have one definition of crisis as something that feels too large to comfortably handle. And then as far as more specifics about feelings, we have financial uncertainty, missing family, coping with art and meditation, exercise and nature, and a lot of anxiety about the unknown.
So it sounds like we're all feeling things differently, and different things are helping us. As far as I heard nature, that's definitely, I can relate to that one too. Just getting outside is really grounding for me.
Thank you, Allison. So if you've not been to the museum before or attended a virtual program with us, it's possible that you might not know very much about Clyfford Still. And right now we're going to be looking at a portrait of Clyfford Still. Still was born in 1904, and he grew up in farms in rural agricultural communities in Alberta, Canada, and Washington State. Around the age of 16, Still received a paint set as a gift, and at this very early age, he began cultivating his artistic talents instead of pursuing life as a farmer. Today, Still is considered the pioneer artist in the abstract expressionist movement. He's very well known for his abstract paintings, though he painted in 3 distinct styles over the course of his career: representational, transitional, and abstract. Representational work is artwork for which it's easy to identify the subject. The images, whether of people, places, or things, are recognizable. Transitional work is artwork where there are still some identifiable aspects, but also elements that may be difficult to recognize or define. An abstract artwork uses color, shape, line, texture, and scale to express more abstract human feelings and emotions. But there aren't universally recognizable images, and each viewer might experience the artwork differently. Still also revolutionized the process of applying paint to canvas. He famously used a trowel or palette knife instead of a paintbrush. I like to think of painting with a trowel kind of like spreading cream cheese on a bagel. You get this really unique kind of texture on the surface of the canvas when you apply paint in this way. Still is not a household name like some of his contemporaries, such as Jackson Pollock or Mark Rothko, because at the height of his career, he chose to mostly withdraw from the art world and work in isolation, though he had correspondence relationships with other artists and still displayed his art in some exhibitions. I want to share a great quote taken from a letter that he wrote at 23 in 1927, which was before he started any formal artistic training. He says, "I'm going to throw myself into art, painting to be specific, with a gusto that may prove me a genius or a wreck." As mentioned earlier, Clyfford Still lived through many historical events and crises. We must say before beginning today that Still almost never talked about the meaning behind his artwork. So while we will be discussing the historical context of crises that Still experienced around the times that he created the artworks that we'll be looking at today, our intention is not to speculate that the subject or the meaning behind the paintings are the crises that he experienced. Rather, we want to think about how these events might have influenced his process and his craft, even if subconsciously or implicitly. Certainly, the world is spending a lot of time today remembering the American Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and 60s that resulted from long-standing and unaddressed racist violence and systems of oppression. The post-war period also marked the beginning of the Cold War, which spanned decades from the late 40s to early 90s. This time was marked by heightened political tension between the Soviet Union and the United States, and a near constant threat of nuclear war. Clyfford Still was alive in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, but unfortunately we know very little about his or any other abstract expressionists' involvement in or thoughts about the civil rights movement or reactions to the Cold War. All of this is to say that we are going to focus today on the historical context that most closely connects to Clyfford Still's life and work, though we recognize that there are many other significant historical events that happened during his lifetime. So today we're going to begin with the 1918 flu pandemic. This was the deadliest flu in history. It infected a large percentage of humanity, as much as one third of the world's population, had a very high mortality rate, overwhelmed hospitals, and spread rapidly throughout the world. Clyfford Still was 14 years old during this pandemic, and as scholars of Still have noted, Still's school was closed during this time. There are many similarities between what Still experienced during this flu pandemic and what we are now experiencing during our own COVID-19 pandemic. Some, but not all, businesses and public services closed for at least some period of time. Communities that did not shut down and follow quarantine procedures for long enough suffered resurgences of the illness, and it was common to see people wearing masks as they went about the activities of their daily lives. Still's early work immediately following this period was representational, and his early subjects were things he saw around him: landscapes, animals, farm buildings and machinery, trains, small town street scenes, portraits, and still lives. This painting that we're looking at here in the gallery is cataloged as PH274, and this was created when Still was 16 years old in 1920. This is among the earliest artwork that we have from Still in the collection at the Clyfford Still Museum. And as you see, it's noticeably absent of human figures. So my question to you as we look at this is, I'd like you to imagine that you are in this scene in 1920 rural Alberta. How do you think a 16-year-old Clyfford Still might have been feeling at this time? What things do you imagine that he was experiencing? And you can please share this with us in the chat. And as you continue to think about this question, we're also going to navigate slowly through these first few galleries with Still's early work so that you can get a sense for how he started his artistic career.
In the chat, we're hearing a lot about isolation, loneliness, desolation, confusion, stillness.
Yeah, I think all of that is really present in that painting, right? Again, we talked about how there's no human figures in that work. And also it's a winter scene, it's quite cold, and you can kind of feel that in the painting. And this would have been, again, 1920 was the year that the work was created. And so although Still was a few years out of the pandemic, it likely would have still been something pretty present in his mind. And again, not to say that this is something that was necessarily intentional for him, but for me, as someone looking at this work from the current perspective of the COVID-19 pandemic, I sort of recognize some of that desolation and loneliness, sort of in a street scene with not very many people. Maybe some of us are familiar with going out and seeing places that are usually quite busy being much less populated these days. Any other thoughts or questions from the chat, Nicole?
We have one more. I think there's a different kind of connection, not to humanity, but to his surroundings. Although a barren scene, the sky in that painting is second to none in his work.
I really like that connection as well, that the subjects of, or the subject of this painting in particular is Still's surroundings. Yeah, it looks like we're gonna go back to this painting real quick to take a look. The subject of this painting is not necessarily any one person, but rather the surroundings that he lives with. And I think we could categorize a lot of Clyfford Still's early work in this way. The subjects of his paintings, as I mentioned, are things like farm equipment and machinery, trains, animals, things that he saw around him in his rural agricultural life. And I think this is really evident in this painting as well. So thanks for taking us back to that, Bailey. And thank you all for your thoughts on this piece in the chat. I'm now going to hand it over to my colleague, Kenda.
Thanks, Corey. Hi, everyone.
So we're going to spend some time exploring Still's art and his life during the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. So this was a time of great struggle for the country, but also a lot of transition for Still personally. So the stock market has crashed. Combining this with massive crop failures due to both environmental factors and farming practices resulted in widespread poverty, hunger, millions of Americans migrating in search of work opportunities. During this time, he gets married, he finishes his undergraduate degree, and he moves to Pullman, where he completes his graduate studies and then teaches at Washington State College. He also has the opportunity to participate in an artist retreat in upstate New York. And this is where we see a big shift in Still's art. So we have this move from this outward look that we saw in those early works that Corey was showing us, where he's observing the world around him, looking at his surroundings, to a much more inward examination of the human condition, of what people are actually experiencing. So Bailey has brought us to Gallery 4. We're gonna take a look at one of these works together. This one is PH 416, and it was painted over between 1934 and 1935. So I wanna take a moment and have everybody just look at this and start seeing what you notice, and tell us in the chat what you're seeing, what's going on in this painting. I know for me, the very first thing I notice is this elongation. And yeah, these massive hands and feet. Look at these things if you haven't seen them yet, they're huge. The hands in particular, it's almost holding this figure in the scene. Like maybe she would fall over if it weren't for that grip. I look at that elongation too, this really long face, these super bony shoulders, and these very elongated limbs. What else are we noticing? Oh, as if she was melting. That's such an interesting word to think about, her kind of dripping down. And these dark eyes, they're almost not even there. We really just kind of have these pits where her eyes would be. Yeah, I think it speaks a lot of hardship. I'm seeing that in the chat, this idea of struggle. So what are we feeling when we look at it? Horror. What else? Yeah, despair, pain, exhaustion, hopelessness. We're noticing the sky again, but this one seems a lot more ominous than that first one that we noticed. Empathy, desperation, a lot of really big feelings from this one. So there's an observation that there's sort of a stability to it visually, even though it's sort of this despairing feeling. There is kind of a solidness to this figure as she sits in the scene and really kind of takes over the whole scene. We look right at her. Sadness and exhaustion. So maybe the idea of some strength in there, despite this adversity and this pain. Yeah, we're noticing a lot of things about how this figure might be feeling and how she's relating to the rest of the scene. Like maybe she can't move, but maybe a determination there too, survival. So what's making us think about things like survival? What are we seeing that's giving us this idea of this despair and this sadness? Noticing again her grip on that bar and this idea that she's a survivor. Yeah, here we are at 1934 and 1935, smack in the middle of depression, right? So we know this was a time when so many people were really struggling. And this vacant stare, that's one of the first things that I noticed too, sort of just blankness along her face, almost like there's really nothing left, like she's already dead inside. And the lack of clothing. We just have this skirt, no shoes, no shirt, no other coverings. She's very exposed. She's very vulnerable. Yeah, and she doesn't seem very concerned. I see this comment too. She doesn't seem concerned about not having a shirt or any other covering. And this lack of clothing does leave her really exposed, but she doesn't seem to have much of a thought about it. Does anyone have any personal connections to this time period or stories from this time period that this image might bring up? So this idea that we might be taking a step back in history because of the skirt and the lack of shoes and the bit. So maybe we're going back even further than the time he's painting in. Maybe a rural connection, which Still would have been really aware of, right? So he grows up on this farm. He gets this opportunity to go to school, to be educated, to learn more about painting, to go to an artist retreat, which is a really interesting thing during this time of struggle, where he got to go spend the whole summer of 1934 just painting and being with other creative people. But he clearly was still thinking about what's going on out in the world, because this is where we see this big shift in his painting, where he starts really examining what people are actually experiencing as opposed to just observing. Yeah, she might be sitting on farm equipment, the end of a long day of work, and a horse nearby. Yeah, so there's that section of white on the right that I have to admit, I didn't even notice at first. I've been so focused on the figure that there's actually a lot of other details going on in the background that you may not notice until you spend a little more time looking at it. Could be a horse, could be an ox. Yeah, we're noticing the contrast to his later work. So those of you that are familiar, we're gonna see this shift from these earlier, more representational works to things that become more and more abstract. But we're starting to see this already, this abstraction of the figure and the way that he starts pulling and shifting the shapes. And yeah, so we still have these other expressions of work and of figures, and we can see some of these other images around the gallery. Like, yeah, let's look at that one in the middle, Bailey, with our workers. What are we noticing here? Oh, the question, I see the question, do we know if there are any big name contemporaries of his that attended this retreat or who the instructors were? We did an exhibit on Yaddo. I don't know some of the names off the top of my head at the moment, but that is something that we would probably have an answer to at some point, or could point you towards a reference to the publication from that exhibit. Yeah, so we see the elongation again of these hands, these limbs, this idea of work, this painful bend to the bodies. And we can't see their faces. So that's a little different than the other one. What does that make us think of? Why does it matter that we can't really see their faces or their expressions? Or does it matter that we can't see their faces? Is that significant? Maybe puts that emphasis back on the work. Yeah, it kind of may dehumanize them. It's not about them as people. Makes them more universal. That connection to American regionalism and the hard work that we see in a lot of art of this time. Yeah. We're making connections to other photos we've seen. Someone's noticing the Napalm Girl, or connection to the Napalm Girl. And as we have this subject shift, we can see Still's painting style sort of continuing to develop. This focus on texture, this focus on distorting the figure as we kind of pan around the gallery. Yeah. Thank you, Emily, for answering our Yaddo question in the chat, so that can give us a little more information for people that are interested in knowing more about that retreat, which does still exist. The name has changed. It was the Trask Foundation that had set it up before. It's in upstate New York. All right, well, I want to thank you all for sharing your thoughts and feelings on those paintings as we got to kind of explore that time period for Still. And then I'm going to hand it back to Allison now for our next section.
Thanks, Kenda. Really quickly, I just want to address too that somebody mentioned Guayasamín, who's an artist from Ecuador, and I actually worked at his fundación. So amazing to learn from everybody here today too, because I actually have not made that connection personally, and now my mind is a little bit blown. So thank you. I'd like to speak about World War II, and World War II, which happened during the 30s and 40s, was yet another crisis during Still's lifetime. And the crisis of World War II specifically changed how artists thought about making their art, how they were creating their art. During the war, death, mortality, morals, these were things that were kind of thrown in people's faces, things that they were working with and against. So these unpleasant kind of big factors in life were things that people were managing, dealing with. During this time, Still developed a new powerful approach to painting that explored universal themes like creation, life, struggle, and death. And this took on substantial relevance after the war. One of Still's colleagues, Barnett Newman, was quoted as saying, "After the monstrosity of war, what do we do? What is there to paint? We have to start all over again." In other words, abstract expressionism is seen by art historians today as a direct response to the war and to all the atrocities that came with the war. So instead of depicting, and I think this gallery is a great example, instead of depicting these recognizable images in representational works of art, abstract expressionists were beginning to use things like color and shape and line to express emotions and feelings. So I would like to focus in on this painting that is cataloged PH 286 in 1943. And just as Kenda was asking some similar questions, I'd love to know what are you specifically noticing with this painting about color and line and shape, and what kind of a feeling does this painting give you?
Fletcher is seeing vertical lines.
So Fletcher's noticing some verticality in this painting. Dark colors, splotches of red. So these colors, I thought this was a really interesting painting to look at because the interaction of the colors. And with that contrast, somebody is noting too, the black against the white. It seems like the black and the white kind of come together in the gray. There's some very deep, dark colors happening here. But yet we also have three other colors, the green, the yellow, the red. And someone saying it feels like water or smoke. That's definitely a feeling that I get when looking at this painting. And I think in the museum, and I think we mentioned this too, that you, all of our whole collection is online. So we definitely encourage you to come back to some of these paintings if you'd like to take a longer look. But this one for me, when I am in the museum, and if I'm standing back away from it, it gives me that feeling of smoke and kind of this rising with the colors on the canvas. It feels suffocating. So for the most part, it seems like this verticality in this painting, and I don't think I've seen anybody mention that there was something recognizable. Does this painting remind you of anything specific? Or is there anything recognizable, anything that really stands out to you? I see tree trunk. So there's, that's a great analogy that kind of, and that's something that I, of course, didn't see either, but this tree trunk verticality, and I'm noticing for me when I look at this too, which I think similar to a tree trunk, you've kind of got these, nubby parts where the branches come out of, and that kind of reminds me almost of the painting that we looked at with Kenda with the knobby shoulders, just kind of these rough parts around this vertical element kind of going up through almost the middle of it. A reference to Denny Dent, maybe a just disjointed skeleton. So all of these ideas about what this painting could possibly be about, we're not exactly sure, but I'm definitely hearing or seeing mentionings of lightness in the middle of darkness, life, nature, some different ideas of how these components in the painting are working together. So a question I'd like to throw out there too is, after experiencing a war, how do you relate to the world around you? A war, a crisis. I think this painting is an interesting example of, do we think this painting is, if this painting could talk to us, would it be looking outward? Would it be looking inward? What kinds of other feelings do we get from it? I love the reference to nature. That's something that I haven't thought as much about. So it feels like it might be looking inward. And does anybody else agree that it might be looking inward, like a cave? Perseverance, darkness towards the light, darkness of war. So these thoughts, these feelings, these emotions, maybe it's processing for all we know. So one more question that I would like to propose is, with that idea of abstract expressionism, kind of as a result of World War II, what are your thoughts on that? Is that a surprise to anybody? Pathways of Hope. Mm-hmm. And this, thank you for backing up, Bailey. This is a great perspective of this gallery and looking at all of the paintings that are currently in this room. Thinking about these paintings maybe as a whole in response to World War II. So looking towards the future, after experiencing that, maybe looking inward, maybe looking outward towards what could be. And definitely life's experience, that's something that we talked a lot about in thinking about this tour, is our own experience a lot of times contributes to our perspective of what we're seeing, and definitely I think what we bring to the paintings. Well, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts in this room. And feel free to type in the chat if there's any more questions or comments about this time frame specifically. I like that, stripping away the non-essential to focus on essentials. Thank you. Okay, so as we go into the next gallery, and we're going to do a little bit of a walk through here. And feel free to keep the comments coming. We're really enjoying those. And then I'll hand it over back to Kenda.
Thanks, Allison. So as Bailey moves us through to our last gallery, we're going to start talking a bit about really sort of the end of Still's life. You know, we've gone through a lot of history, and Still had such a long and prolific career as an artist. He started early in his life. He never stopped. In 1978, he was diagnosed with cancer. He did not stop painting, but the majority of his art during this time are works on paper. So think for a second about how physical it must have been to get up on a ladder and paint canvases of the size that he's most known for, like the ones that we're seeing in this gallery, the ones that are taller than us. What that must have been like to be climbing up and down, grabbing your palette knife, bringing your paints. And while we can't say for sure what role art played for Still specifically around his diagnosis and illness, but I think we can say that art became an outlet for Still to explore the human condition, including emotions. And we often talk about his works on paper as a kind of visual diary, where we get to see him working through ideas. Still did lose his battle with cancer in 1980. So as we start kind of looking at these last pieces and thinking about the things we've been talking today, for me, it really came back to this idea that art tells stories. It can tell individual stories of a person, the collective stories of a time, and it can offer us a way to process or even heal from crisis and trauma, either through its creation or through its exploration. So I would like to share another quote from Still, where he said, "I choose that my art be engaged in that which exalts the spirit of man." These words can give us a glimpse into how Clyfford Still felt about his art and make me think about how we might see people respond through and with art to the crises that we are living through right now. So as we start kind of wrapping up this conversation today and thinking about this idea of how art can help us process, can be maybe an expression of what we're experiencing or a way to work through what we're experiencing, what is this bringing up for you all as you sort of virtually walk through these galleries with us, see these paintings? We've got this idea from Chris about the outlet. The outlet is so evident and understandable at this time. Creatives have to create. What else is all of this bringing up for us? Is this kind of artistic expression something that we'll always see in these kinds of moments? That this moment will pass, but the art itself maybe has a more eternal quality, something lasting. The need to share with others, hoping that they will understand. Well, and that's a big one, right? Whether people will understand what it is we're trying to share, or if that matters as much. You know, with Still, we have all these images we've looked at and no titles and nothing to tell us what we're supposed to be thinking and feeling. But we have that opportunity then to make our own meaning. So that's a whole nother question of whether knowing the intent matters for our own meaning. We're noticing the visual differences just even in these works, seeing how open they are. We have much more blank canvas at this point. And this last piece that Bailey stopped us on that we're looking at is PH 1049. And this one was painted towards the end of Still's life. This was between, I think, 1977 and 1978. So this is more reflective of the kinds of works we're seeing at the end of his life. Oh, Adrian talks about letting go of worldly concerns, focusing on the spiritual and life beyond. Linda, deep questions about connections. Yeah. Barbara's talking about how we all change and differ as life and events change us. Yeah, and we get to see that with Still in his work. You know, thinking all the way back to that first piece we looked at today with our Main Street and with our cows, and getting to see that shift and that transition as we go around the galleries, as Still's work becomes more abstract, as Still's work turns more inward, all the way to sort of the end of our journey today with these very abstracted, large-scale pieces. And noticing things about color, feelings about conflict and intrusion. So many different ways that we can come to these pieces too, and that we might be interpreting them on our own. Lightness, almost frivolous rather than ponderous, so that maybe this one has a really different feel than some of the other ones we've seen. Sparse. Yeah, so the idea that this piece is sparse and may represent his dwindling strength and ebbing away of his health and ultimately his life. Yeah, so for some of us, even though this one is more free and more open, has a sense of space, has a sense of light, that might also come with that ebbing away, that dwindling. I think that's a really interesting idea with this piece and with the way we see our shapes. Like, are they coming down instead of going up? And the idea of our space. Yeah, so there's so many different ways to come at these works. And I just want to, go back to this idea of Still's words. And he says, I choose that my art be engaged in that which exalts the spirit of man. And so I think this can help us be thinking about how he may have felt about his art, but also it makes me really think again about how people might be responding to this moment with their own art, with this exploration of art, with moments like we've had today, with individual moments. I hope that leaves us all with a lot to think about and a lot that we may have been able to share with each other today. So thank you. Thank you for spending time with us today. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and your ideas and your feelings. We had a lot of really big ones today, and we appreciate you spending part of your day with us.
Thanks, Kenda, and thanks to Allison and Corey so much for facilitating this tour, and Bailey doing the steering behind the scenes, and to all of you for participating in this tour today.